The cafe was busy as usual, with the sound of coffee machines whirring and the chatter of customers filling the air. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting warm rays on the tables where people sat, sipping their drinks and enjoying their conversations. Among the crowd was a young black woman who had just entered the cafe with a quiet confidence. She smiled as she walked to the counter, ready to order her usual coffee. Nothing special, just a moment of peace in the middle of her hectic day. She was dressed casually, looking forward to the relaxing break the cafe would provide. Her calm demeanor contrasted with the hustle and bustle of the busy place. She was just another person in the crowd, unaware that she was about to become the center of attention in a way she never could have imagined. As she waited for her drink, she noticed a security guard standing near the entrance, watching the customers as they came and went. His eyes seemed to linger a little longer on her than anyone else, though she didn't pay much attention at first. After all, security guards were always around, just doing their job. However, she soon began to feel the weight of his gaze on her. The guard was tall and had a serious look on his face. His uniform was neat, and he looked professional enough, but there was something about the way he stared that made her uncomfortable. She tried to ignore it and focused on the barista, who was now handing her the steaming cup of coffee. As she reached for it, she heard footsteps approaching her from behind. "Excuse me, miss." The guard's voice broke through the noise of the cafe. It was firm, but not overly loud. She turned to face him, a slight frown on her face, not sure what was happening. "I'm going to need you to come with me for a quick check," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She blinked in confusion. A check? What kind of check? Was this some sort of misunderstanding? She hadn't done anything wrong. The guard's expression didn't change, and for a moment, she felt a knot form in her stomach. "Is there a problem?" she asked, hoping he was just making a mistake. "I said it's for your own safety," he replied, giving her a cold look. "Please, come with me." Still unsure of what was going on, she followed him to a quieter corner of the cafe. People around her were starting to notice, and a few turned their heads in curiosity. The young woman's discomfort grew as the guard guided her, his eyes constantly on her. She felt her heart beat faster as she tried to figure out what was happening. What was this about? Why was she being singled out? She had never experienced anything like this before. She had simply come to the cafe for a moment of calm. And now she was being led away by a security guard in front of everyone. She didn't know what to do, so she stayed silent, her mind racing with confusion and unease. The guard, however, seemed completely calm, as if this was just another part of his routine. As they reached a secluded spot in the cafe, the guard stood in front of her, his arms crossed. She could sense the tension building in the air. What was going to happen next? The young woman stood there, feeling more confused and uncomfortable with every passing second. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the uncertainty of it all was starting to weigh heavily on her. The cafe, which had once felt like a calm escape from her busy day, now seemed like an unfamiliar, hostile place. She looked around, hoping someone would intervene or at least ask what was going on. But everyone seemed to mind their own business, some even avoiding eye contact with her. The guard stood in front of her, silent for a moment, as if assessing her. His eyes never left her face, and she could feel the intensity of his gaze, making her feel even more uneasy. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to figure out what to do. Should she ask him again why he was doing this? Should she demand an explanation? But something in his expression told her that he wasn't about to explain himself. Instead, he simply stood there, as though waiting for her to make the next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guard spoke again, his voice cold and unwavering. "I'm going to need to do a quick check," he said. His words hung in the air, each syllable adding to the tension between them. She felt a surge of frustration rising within her. A check. What kind of check was he talking about? Was this some sort of routine security measure? She had been in plenty of public places before, restaurants, stores, even other cafes, and had never been asked to undergo anything like this. She had done nothing wrong. So why was this happening to her? "I don't understand," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but still clear. "What do you mean by a check? I haven't done anything." The guard's expression didn't soften, but his tone remained firm. "It's for your safety. Just cooperate, and it will be over quickly." The woman's mind raced. She wanted to argue, to demand that he explain himself, but something about the situation made her feel powerless. His authority, his calm demeanor, made it feel like she had no choice but to comply. "Please," she said again, trying to keep her voice steady. "I really don't understand. What's this about?" But the guard wasn't offering any answers. Instead, he took a step forward, his hand reaching for her outer jacket. "I'm just doing my job," he said flatly, as if repeating a script he had memorized. "Now, please take off your jacket." She froze. The shock of his words hit her like a wave. Her heart started racing, and she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Take off her jacket. Was this really happening? She wanted to protest, but the coldness in the guard's eyes and the way he stood there made her hesitate. She couldn't help but feel that if she refused, things would only get worse. The cafe around them continued as usual, the noise of clinking cups and casual conversations still echoing in the background. But to the woman, it felt like everything had paused, all eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. For a long moment, she stood there, her mind spinning. Should she fight back? Should she walk away? But she knew deep down that she couldn't just leave. The situation had already escalated too far. So, reluctantly, she began to remove her jacket, feeling the eyes of the room upon her. Every movement felt heavy, as though she was performing some strange ritual that she had no control over. The air seemed to thicken around her as the guard stood, silent and unmoving, watching her every move. As she hesitated, she felt the sting of humiliation burn at the edges of her consciousness. But there was no turning back now. She had no choice but to comply. The woman slowly slid her jacket off her shoulders, her heart pounding with each movement. As she did, she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the cafe on her. A few customers glanced her way, some obviously uncomfortable, while others pretended not to notice, focusing on their own drinks or phones. But it was impossible to ignore the tension that had filled the room. The air felt thick, as though everyone knew something was wrong, but no one knew what to do about it. She carefully placed her jacket on the chair beside her, her mind still racing with confusion and frustration. Why was this happening? Why was she being singled out? She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just a customer, trying to enjoy a peaceful moment. And now she found herself in the middle of a scene she never could have imagined. The guard's cold, unblinking stare was fixed on her, making her feel even more self-conscious. The silence between them grew, adding to the awkwardness of the moment. He didn't say anything, but his presence loomed over her like an unspoken command. She shifted her weight, feeling exposed and vulnerable, wondering if this would be the end of it, or if the situation would escalate even further. One of the customers, who had been watching from the corner of the cafe, finally stood up. The woman could feel their eyes on her, but it wasn't just the guard now. The entire cafe seemed to be holding its breath. The person who had stood up moved closer, their footsteps loud against the wooden floor, as if to remind everyone that someone was willing to speak up. "What's going on here?" the customer asked, their voice rising just enough to break the uneasy silence. Their eyes were locked on the guard, who didn't flinch or look away. The woman, still standing there, felt a small surge of hope. Maybe someone would help her. Maybe someone would finally stop this madness. The guard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the person who had spoken, his face hardening slightly. "This is a security issue," he said flatly, still not offering any real explanation. His voice didn't hold any warmth, but there was something dismissive about it, as though he expected people to just accept his authority without question. The customer seemed taken aback, but didn't back down. "A security issue? What do you mean?" She's just a regular customer. You don't have the right to treat her like this." The woman could see the guard's eyes narrow at the challenge. His posture stiffened, and for a moment, she wondered if he might do something even more extreme. But instead, he simply turned his attention back to her, as though the other customer's words didn't matter at all. She felt the heat rising in her face. The words the customer had spoken had felt like a small victory, but it was clear now that this wouldn't be resolved so easily. The guard wasn't going to back down. He had already decided what was going to happen, and there was no room for argument. She looked around the cafe again, hoping to find some support, some sign that people were willing to stand with her. But all she saw were faces frozen in indecision, avoiding eye contact or looking at their phones. No one was stepping forward. The realization hit her hard. She was alone in this. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and for a brief moment, she wished she could just disappear. The guard's eyes were back on her, and he reached for her coat once more. It was clear that this wasn't going to end anytime soon, and she felt a surge of frustration rise within her. How much longer would this go on? She didn't know, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stand there and just let it happen. But what could she do? The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and the silence in the cafe was deafening. The woman's mind was spinning. She couldn't understand why the guard was treating her this way, why she was being singled out like this in front of everyone. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being in this situation, but the sheer disbelief that it was happening at all. Her heart was racing, her body tense, and she could feel the eyes of the room still on her. The whispers of others were barely audible, but the weight of the room's judgment hung heavy in the air. She had no idea how much longer she could endure this. The guard's hand was still extended toward her coat. He stood there with an air of finality, as if he had all the authority in the world to make demands. She felt the blood rush to her face as the silence stretched between them, making the moment feel like an eternity. She could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears, drowning out the background noise of the cafe. "Please, stop," she managed to say, her voice wavering. It felt like a plea to the universe, not just to the guard. She couldn't believe she had to ask for something so basic, just to be treated like a normal person, like anyone else. She felt her hands tremble slightly as she reached for the coat, holding it tighter. She wasn't sure what to do anymore. Was this really happening? Was there anyone who would stand up for her? But the guard didn't back down. "I told you, it's a security check," he repeated, his voice almost mechanical, like it was the only explanation he had prepared. "Now, please remove the rest of your outer layers. I'm only doing my job." His words felt like a punch to her stomach. What was this about? Why was she being asked to remove her coat? She tried to steady her breath, pushing back the rising tide of anger and frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. This wasn't about safety or security. It was about something else, something that made no sense. The guard's stare never wavered. His focus was on her. And the longer she stood there, the more she realized that he wasn't going to let her leave without complying. He wasn't going to change his mind, no matter how uncomfortable or confused she felt. The thought of just walking away crossed her mind, but there was no clear escape. The cafe had become a strange battleground, with no way to retreat. "I don't understand," she said, her voice now more firm than before. She had to try. She couldn't just accept this treatment, not without an explanation. "I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you doing this?" The guard didn't respond right away. His eyes darted briefly to the people around them, as though checking if anyone was paying attention to what was happening. When he finally spoke again, his tone remained detached. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just take off the coat, and we'll be done." She felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. This wasn't just about the coat or a security check anymore. It was about being treated like she didn't have control over her own body, over her own choices. The more the guard spoke, the more it became clear that he saw her as something to be handled, something to be controlled. Around her, the murmurs in the cafe grew louder. She could see some people glancing over, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. But still, no one stepped forward to intervene. The silence was deafening, and she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She was at the center of something she didn't understand, and no one was doing anything to help. The guard's gaze was unwavering. He wasn't about to give up, and she could feel her resistance starting to crumble. This wasn't how she imagined her day would go. She had come in for a quiet coffee, not to become the target of something she couldn't control. The room felt smaller now, and she felt like she was suffocating in it. The cafe that had once been a refuge now felt like a cage. With a deep breath, she looked at the guard, her mind racing for a way to make this stop. But what could she do? As the tension in the cafe grew, the woman's mind raced, trying to find a way out of this impossible situation. She was caught in an uncomfortable silence, her eyes darting from the guard to the other customers who had started to take notice. Some glanced nervously over at her, others stared in disbelief, but no one seemed willing to speak up. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a heavy cloud, suffocating any hope of resolving the situation peacefully. She felt alone, exposed, and uncertain. The murmurs from the crowd began to grow louder. She could hear faint whispers, but none of them reached her clearly. The silence was broken when a voice called out from across the cafe. It was a woman standing by a table near the window, her brow furrowed in concern. The woman had been watching the interaction from the beginning, and now she couldn't stay quiet any longer. "What's going on here?" the woman called out, her voice clear and filled with confusion. The attention in the room shifted immediately toward her. The young woman felt a small glimmer of hope rise within her. Finally, someone was speaking up. Finally, someone was asking the question she had been too afraid to voice. The guard turned to look at the woman who had spoken, his expression hardening. The air seemed to crackle with tension as the two locked eyes, but the guard didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted his gaze back to the woman standing in front of him, still waiting for her to remove her jacket. The whole room was watching, the cafe now feeling like a stage with a very uncomfortable performance unfolding before them. "This is a security issue," the guard finally said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. He didn't look at the woman who had asked the question but kept his focus on the young woman in front of him, as though his answer was enough to justify his actions. The words felt rehearsed, like a defense that had been prepared long before. But the more he said it, the less it made sense. The woman who had spoken raised her eyebrows, clearly not satisfied with his response. "A security issue? That doesn't explain why she's being treated like this. She hasn't done anything wrong," she said, her tone firm, though there was an unmistakable hint of frustration in her voice. She took a few steps closer to the scene, her eyes still fixed on the guard. "What's your name? I think we need to have a conversation about this." The guard didn't flinch, but the woman's words seemed to have an impact. He glanced around the cafe again, noticing that more people were starting to take notice of the conversation. His confidence seemed to waver slightly, though he didn't show it on the surface. He didn't answer her question, but the tension in his body suggested he was beginning to realize that this situation was starting to spiral out of his control. The young woman, still standing there, felt a small sense of relief. For the first time since the guard had approached her, she wasn't the only one speaking up. Someone else had noticed her discomfort. Someone else had seen the injustice of the situation. But even with the support of the woman who had stepped in, she still felt trapped. The guard wasn't backing down, and the eyes of the room were still focused on her, waiting for her to comply. "I'm asking you again," the woman who had spoken said, her voice more forceful now. "Why are you treating her this way? This isn't normal." She glanced around at the other customers. "Does anyone else see what's wrong with this? Why is no one helping?" The room was silent for a long moment. The other customers exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke up. The woman's words hung in the air, unanswered, as if no one had the courage to challenge the authority of the guard. The young woman's frustration grew. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to act, too afraid to take a stand. The guard finally stepped back slightly, his face tense, though he didn't break eye contact with the woman who had spoken up. He said nothing more, but the unease in the room was palpable. The young woman's heart was still pounding, and she felt the weight of the moment settle on her once more. Even though someone had spoken up for her, she was still stuck in the middle of a situation she didn't understand, with no clear way out. The silence seemed to stretch on, and the more she tried to gather her thoughts, the more the weight of the situation seemed to crush them. Would anyone else step forward? Would this nightmare ever end? The room was thick with tension, the uneasy silence growing as every moment stretched on. The young woman stood there, still unsure of what to do, but now with more people aware of the situation. The woman who had spoken up, still standing with a sense of determination, seemed to have made a small crack in the barrier that had surrounded the scene. Yet, despite her courage, the guard wasn't backing down. His gaze remained cold, fixed on the young woman in front of him, as though nothing had changed. She felt her heart beat faster, her mind racing for a solution, but every idea she thought of felt like it wouldn't be enough. The cafe, once a place of quiet comfort, now felt suffocating. The voices around her seemed distant, muffled by the tension in her own chest. She wanted to move, to leave, but the feeling of being trapped kept her rooted to the spot. The guard still wasn't giving any reason for his actions, and no one else had stepped forward to challenge him, despite the woman's bold attempts. Then, just when she thought things couldn't feel more uncertain, the unexpected happened. Another voice rang out, this time from the back of the cafe. It was a man, sitting by the counter who had been silently watching from the start. He was middle-aged, his hair slightly graying, and his face was now filled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He had been quietly sipping his coffee, but something about the scene in front of him had stirred him to action. "Enough," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the cafe. He stood from his chair, his hands gripping the back of it, as if ready to march forward. The whole room turned their attention to him, and for a brief moment, the focus shifted away from the woman and the guard. The man's words were like a small spark in a room full of dry wood, igniting something that had been waiting to happen. "This is wrong," he continued, his voice firm but calm. "You don't treat people like this. This is a public space, not a place for intimidation." His words were direct, aimed squarely at the guard, who looked taken aback by the sudden confrontation. The air seemed to shift, and the tension that had once felt suffocating began to loosen just slightly. The guard's eyes narrowed, but instead of responding immediately, he seemed to consider the man's words. For the first time since the woman had entered the cafe, the guard appeared uncertain. His posture shifted just enough to indicate that he was momentarily thrown off balance by the growing sense of defiance in the room. The woman stood still, taking in what was happening. She had been trapped in the middle of this nightmare, but now, it felt as if there was a shift in the balance. The man's words were like a rope thrown into a stormy sea, pulling her back from the overwhelming feeling of being utterly alone. She wasn't the only one witnessing this injustice anymore. The voices that had been silent were slowly beginning to rise, one after the other. "We're all customers here. No one has the right to make her feel unsafe," the man added, his voice gaining strength. He was no longer speaking just for the woman, but for everyone who had witnessed the awkward and uncomfortable scene unfolding. As the words echoed through the cafe, the woman felt the strength in them, even though she couldn't fully process the relief. She didn't know this man, but his decision to speak up had shaken the sense of helplessness that had gripped her. Other customers, who had been too timid to say anything before, now began to murmur in agreement. It was as if the walls of tension were crumbling, piece by piece. The guard, still holding his ground, seemed less sure of himself now. He glanced around the room, noticing that more people were observing him, watching him carefully. His actions, once unquestioned, were now being scrutinized. The man's challenge had opened the floodgates for others, and now it was no longer just a battle between him and the woman. It had become something bigger. The room was shifting. The cafe that had once felt oppressive now felt like a space where change might be possible. The young woman, though still shaken, felt the tiniest flicker of hope. The guard was no longer the only voice in the room. People were starting to stand up, one by one, and her quiet desire for support was beginning to materialize in the most unexpected way. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted noticeably. The tension that had hung thick in the air just moments before was now slowly dissipating. The man's words, strong and direct, had stirred something in the room. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the fact that someone had finally taken a stand, vocalizing what everyone else had been too afraid to say. The silence that followed his declaration wasn't one of awkwardness, but one of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The young woman, still standing in front of the guard, felt the weight of the moment finally start to lift, just a little. The guard had paused, his eyes flicking between the man who had spoken up and the group of customers now beginning to stir. His once confident posture seemed a little less certain. His rigid stance softened slightly as he processed the shift in the room. It was as though he could feel the weight of the collective attention on him, and the power dynamic that had been so firmly in his control was beginning to waver. The man who had spoken was now joined by a few others who had been quietly watching from their tables. Some of them began to speak up, albeit quietly at first, but enough to be heard. "You shouldn't be treating her this way," one customer muttered, while another added, "It's not right." Their voices were soft, but they added a ripple to the growing movement of support. The guard, who had previously seemed immune to the discomfort of the crowd, now began to look uncertain. A few people even began to rise from their seats, their chairs scraping slightly against the floor as they stood. The woman who had spoken up first was still standing nearby, her arms crossed as she watched the scene unfold. Her expression was resolute, and though she hadn't yet directly addressed the guard again, her presence seemed to embolden the others who were now starting to gather courage. The young woman, who had been at the center of the storm for so long, began to feel a sense of relief, but also a sense of awe. She hadn't known that these people, strangers in a cafe, would come together in this way. She hadn't known that her silent discomfort, her fear, and humiliation would spark something in others. She had only wanted to be left alone, to enjoy a peaceful moment in the cafe. But what had started as a personal attack on her dignity had now become a collective stand for what was right. The guard's face was starting to flush with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. He looked around, no longer certain of his authority in the situation. "This is not your business," he said, his voice a little shakier than before. It was as if he was trying to regain control of the situation, but the more he spoke, the more people seemed to grow in their resolve. The cafe's manager, who had been in the back, appeared at the entrance of the small kitchen. She had been alerted to the commotion and came rushing over. Her gaze quickly moved between the guard and the group of customers now gathered in defiance. The woman, who had been the target of the guard's actions, was still standing, her posture a little straighter now, bolstered by the unexpected support of those around her. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, her voice sharp but controlled. She addressed the guard first, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the situation. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone clearly demanding an explanation. The guard looked at the manager, then back at the woman, as if trying to decide whether to continue his actions or back down. His face was flushed, and his stance was no longer as assertive as it had been. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat as if he was struggling to come up with a convincing justification for his behavior. The young woman felt a wave of empowerment wash over her. Finally, someone with authority was stepping in. Finally, someone was going to address this situation properly. The manager didn't give the guard a chance to respond before she turned her attention to the woman, offering her a look of understanding. "Are you all right?" the manager asked gently. There was no rush in her voice, no judgment, just a simple question that felt like a lifeline after everything that had happened. The young woman nodded, her voice shaking slightly as she replied, "I'm fine, thank you." Though she still felt shaken, She was no longer alone in this. She had found her voice, and others had found theirs as well. And now, as the manager took control of the situation, she felt a sense of justice starting to emerge, a sense that this moment would not be defined by fear or shame, but by the courage of people willing to stand up for what was right. The guard, now visibly flustered, took a step back. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape from the collective gaze of the cafe. The power had shifted, and it was clear that the guard, now visibly uncomfortable, stepped back, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to regain some semblance of control. But the moment had passed. His actions had sparked a ripple of support that he could no longer ignore. The manager, now firmly in charge of the situation, turned to the young woman and gave her a reassuring smile. "Thank you for your patience," the manager said softly, her voice calm and composed. "I'm terribly sorry this happened. This is not how we run things here." She spoke to the entire cafe, her tone making it clear that the situation was being taken seriously. The other customers, some of whom had been nervously watching the scene unfold, seemed to relax a bit, now that it was clear that the situation was being handled. The young woman, still shaken but relieved, nodded slowly. She had expected an apology from the manager, but the support she had received from the customers had been completely unexpected. It was a simple thing, but to her, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. She had been able to stand her ground, but more importantly, others had stepped in when she needed it most. "Are you sure you're okay?" the manager asked, her eyes filled with concern. The young woman smiled faintly, grateful for the kindness that was being shown to her. "Yes, I'm all right now. Thank you." The guard, who had been standing awkwardly near the back of the cafe, looked as though he wanted to disappear into the floor. His actions had not only been questioned, but publicly confronted, and he seemed at a loss for what to do next. He glanced at the manager, who gave him a firm look, signaling that she would be handling the rest of the matter. Without a word, he turned and quickly exited the cafe, his footsteps loud in the sudden stillness. As the door swung closed behind him, a quiet sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the room. The young woman exhaled, feeling the tension leave her body. She hadn't realized just how tightly wounded she had been until the moment the guard left. It was over. The ordeal was finally behind her. The manager turned back to her with a genuine, apologetic smile. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again," she assured the young woman. "If you need anything, just let me know. Your comfort is our priority." The woman nodded, appreciating the manager's sincerity. She felt a sense of gratitude for the way the situation had been handled, for the way the manager had taken charge and given her the support she needed when she had felt so vulnerable. As the cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the young woman took a deep breath. She could hear the soft hum of conversation starting up again, the clink of coffee cups, and the casual chatter that had once felt so distant. But now, it felt like the background noise was a little more comforting. The room wasn't just filled with customers. There was a sense of shared experience, of people coming together to ensure that what had happened wouldn't be swept under the rug. Before she left, the woman turned to the table where the man who had spoken up earlier was sitting. He smiled at her warmly, and she gave him a nod of thanks. His willingness to stand up for what was right had been a turning point, and it was something she would always remember. In that moment, she realized that even the smallest acts of courage could make a huge difference. As she walked out of the cafe, she felt lighter, the weight of the incident lifting with every step. She had walked in as just another customer, hoping for a simple break, but she was leaving with something more meaningful than just a cup of coffee. She had experienced a moment of injustice, but more importantly, she had witnessed the power of community, of people coming together to make things right. And as she stepped out into the street, she felt hopeful. In the face of adversity, there were always people willing to stand up for what was right, and that was something she could carry with her wherever she went.